Okay, welcome to the second Neanderthal behavior video. We're going to be talking about Neanderthal injuries and health and Neanderthal burials. Okay, injuries and health. So Neanderthals, in short, lived a rough and tumble life. So most skeletal remains from Neanderthals show trauma. So here's a figure of that. So you can see at different regions of the body, right? And here is the degree of trauma. So the higher the bar, the more trauma. And you can see that these two different blue colors are quite similar. And it's interesting because the light blue belongs to a rodeo rider and the dark blue belongs to a Neanderthal. So Neanderthals had degrees of trauma very similar to rodeo riders, right? And rodeo riders basically have to endure this. So they're riding a bucking bull that's just throwing them off. Sometimes the bull will just go after them and just kind of spear them with their horns, so they get tossed around a lot of injuries. So what could Neanderthals have been doing where they would have been exposed to trauma similar to this? Well, you can't answer, so I'll just show you. So one hypothesis is that they accumulated all these injuries during hunting. So remember, they had thrusting spears, so they had to get up pretty close to the animals that they were hunting. And so if you're hunting something big and mean and bad, like this thing, well, there's probably going to be a lot of danger and injury involved. And you can see just based on the expression of this Neanderthal, just how crazy this hunting experience was. So yeah, this is kind of a crazy graphic artist depiction, but it gets the point across. Hunting up close with thrusting spears is very dangerous and likely exposed to a lot of trauma and injury. Okay, another interesting case study comes from Shanidar Cave, located in Iraq, and is dated to 45,000 years ago. Okay, so specifically, let's look at this one individual called Shanidar 1. That's a specimen number, and this was an adult male. So Shanidar 1 has had a healed fracture on the 5th metatarsal and a healed fracture on the left orbit, which you kind of really can't see well on these pictures. Okay, so Shanidar 1 was 40 years old, so pretty old by Neanderthal standards. Had arthritis, right? Again, emphasizing how old this individual was. Trauma to the head and face, such that this individual is possibly blind. And if you see here, the upper arm bone, the right one, is very withered relative to the left side. And that could be due to a number of things. One hypothesis is that if you don't know, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So it's thought that the trauma to the left side of the face and head likely could have caused some damage and inhibited motor control of this right arm, which if it wasn't used, the muscles would have atrophied, the bone would have become withered. I think your book says that another hypothesis is that this arm was amputated, and thus that's what contributed to the disuse and the withering of the upper right arm. And perhaps this explains the anterior wear on the incisors, because if one arm couldn't be used, then this Neanderthal individual had to use its teeth basically as a second arm. There are multiple wounds to the right leg, which you can't see here. And so the question is, could this individual have survived to 40 years old, arthritic, possibly blind? Could he have survived without help? And so most people would say no. So this is indirect evidence that Neanderthals were helping each other. There was some assistance, and this is possibly indicative of compassion and altruism, which is a very human trait. Okay, so here's another example, kind of on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So this individual is Shanidar 3. And this is possible evidence for interpersonal violence. So if we look at one of the ribs and we zoom in, we see that there is this injury here right? Like a cut or something embedded in the bone, which has been subsequently healed over. So this injury didn't immediately kill this individual, right? So this is a healed puncture wound on the left rib, likely caused by a stone point. And the stone point likely remained embedded in the rib because you see the bone healing around this injury. And death is estimated to have occurred 3 weeks after the original injury, based on the degree of healing. So how did this individual get a rib or get a point stuck in its rib? Well, likely due to interpersonal violence. Okay, so now let's look at burials. So the big question with Neanderthal burials, well, it's no question that they were definitely burying their dead. We have these amazingly preserved skeletons. You can tell based on the geology that a hole was dug and infilled with sediment or dirt afterwards. So it's no question that Neanderthals bury their dead. The main question is whether that burial was symbolic or was it practical. So by symbolic, I mean, were there religious overtones? Was it ceremonial, right? Which would imply that Neanderthals understood death. Maybe they believed in an afterlife, right? So this symbolic thinking that is very akin to us. Or was it practical in the way that burials were just a way to get rid of the rotting smell and to prevent carnivores from coming in and checking out that smell, right? So Neanderthals, a lot of them are buried in this flexed posture. And the question is, could it be symbolic? Maybe, you come into the world as a flexed body. Maybe you leave the world as such. Or it could be practical, right? If you flex the body, that means you have to dig a smaller hole, less work. So this is a big debate, open question. Neanderthal burials in general, there are over 30 possible cases, which is quite a lot. Many were discovered in the early 20th century, so there were poor excavation standards, so there wasn't as much detail about them as would be collected today. And there are possible grave goods, but nothing definitive, right? And again, grave goods, burying an individual with something that has no practical value, that could definitely symbolize a belief in the afterlife, like something for the individual to take with them when they go to the afterlife. Here's another interesting cave study. So from that same cave, Shanidar Cave in Iraq, again, dated to 45,000 years ago. There is this one burial there. We see it flexed, right? And some of these flex burials, the arms are actually positioned in a very particular way, which does suggest some type of symbolic purpose. Like if you were just digging a small hole and shoving a body in there, you wouldn't really care how the arms are positioned. But there's something very special about this burial, right? And so there are unusual clumps of pollen in the burial, which indicates flowers. So not only was this individual buried in the fetal position, which could suggest some type of symbolic practice, but they were also covered with flowers, presumably. And of course, this does not have any practical meaning and could suggest some symbolic thinking, some belief in the afterlife. But naysayers will say that the pollen wasn't placed there by other Neanderthals, that the pollen got to the burial because rodents were burrowing and pollen kind of blew in after the fact. So the pollen had nothing to do with the burial act itself. So whether it was actually flowers placed on the individual during burial or later deposition by burrowing rodents, that's an open question. Okay, so that concludes the second behavior video. The next and final behavioral video will cover symbolic behavior in general.